Hi, I'm Clara, and today's story will take you on a journey of betrayal and sweet revenge. I say, voice low and steady, because the best confessions sound like they could be whispered across a kitchen table at midnight. This is the story of how a life I thought I understood was quietly rewritten by a woman who smiled while she did it, my stepmother. My father's house smelled like old paper and coffee. He kept things in order. Ledgers, a battered leather chair, a calendar with neat handwriting. After he died, the house felt too big and too quiet. That's when Vivian arrived with a suitcase and a practiced smile. She was polished in a way that made people relax around her. The right laugh, the right anecdote, the right sympathy. She handled the funeral arrangements with a competence that looked like care. People said she'd been a godsend. I wanted to believe them. At first, the changes were small and almost tender. She reorganized the kitchen, labeled the pantry, and insisted on family photos that looked like postcards. But the small things became a pattern. She began to move my father's papers into a locked drawer for safekeeping. She suggested we update the will to avoid confusion. She used phrases like stability and protecting the family the way other people use prayers. Her hands were always steady. Her smile never faltered. The first time I saw the amendment, it felt like a physical blow. I was sorting through a box of my father's correspondence when I found a stamped envelope from the estate attorney. Inside was a new page, an amendment to the will. My name, the child who had been promised a portion of the estate, had been replaced. The numbers were precise and cold. $12.6 million redirected. The signature looked like my father's, but something about the pressure of the pen fell off. My stomach dropped. The house tilted. When I confronted Vivian, she did what she always did. She smiled and used the language of care. "Your father wanted stability," she said, smoothing a napkin. "I'm protecting the family." Her voice was soft, but the words landed like a verdict. She posted a photo of herself with the attorney on social media, captioned with gratitude and stewardship. The likes rolled in. People praised her for being decisive. I felt exposed, like a private wound displayed on a public stage. Humiliation settled in slow, precise layers. At family dinners, she would make jokes about my financial irresponsibility in front of guests. At holiday gatherings, she'd rearrange seating so I sat at the kids' table, even when I was older than some of the adults. She corrected my tone in front of friends. She used the word debt as a weapon, as if money could erase a lifetime of love. The worst part was how she made the theft look like care. "I'm doing this for the family," she'd say, and people nodded. The emotional toll was physical. I started flinching at the sound of her heels in the hallway. My hands would tremble when I opened mail. Sleep became a thin, interrupted thing. Friends noticed the change, the way I stopped bringing people home, the way laughter got clipped. "You okay?" they'd ask. I would say the words people expect. "Yeah, I'm fine." But inside, a pressure built, like a kettle on a low flame. The humiliation was public. The shame was private. I tried to reason with the estate attorney. He was polite and professional, and at first he seemed to believe the paperwork was in order. The notary's stamp was real. The signatures looked authentic. It felt like a fortress built of ink and polite sentences. I felt small in rooms where Vivian's voice carried. She had turned the language of law into a curtain that hid the theft. But humiliation has a way of hardening into resolve. The first time I let the anger surface, it felt like a physical thing. A heat behind the eyes, a clench in the jaw, a hand that trembled not from fear but from the force of wanting to act. I realized I could either be a character in the story she was telling, or I could become the person who wrote the next chapter. The idea of revenge didn't arrive as a cartoonish plot. It arrived as a moral calculation. If Vivian wanted to build a life on a lie, then the answer had to be truth that could be proven. So I started to document. It sounds boring, but documentation is the backbone of any case that needs to stand in front of a judge. I kept a journal. Not just of the big humiliations, but of the small ones. The way she corrected my tone in front of guests, the nights she locked the study, the times she insisted on public displays that felt performative. I saved screenshots of social media posts, the photo of her with the attorney, and every email that hinted at a change. The act of writing was itself a kind of reclamation. Where once I had swallowed humiliation, now I recorded it. I also began to look for witnesses. There were neighbors who had seen her rearrange the garden and heard her boast about securing the future. There was the housekeeper who had noticed late-night calls and odd bank transfers. People were hesitant at first. Who wants to get involved in family drama? But when I explained the stakes, they agreed, to be honest. Their statements were ordinary and human, and that ordinariness made them credible. The first section of this story ends with a decision. I would not let the paper fortress stand. The next part is where the plan takes shape. The forensic analysis, the quiet calls to a lawyer who believed me, the way I learned to turn humiliation into evidence. Stay with me, because the slow work of gathering proof is where the tension builds, and where the person who smiled while taking $12.6 million begins to feel the first tremors of. When Clara tells a revenge story, she doesn't mean a movie montage of sabotage. The kind of revenge that sticks is patient, legal, and built on the antagonist's own arrogance. Vivian's power came from appearances, polished photos, confident statements, and a narrative of benevolent stewardship. If that narrative could be punctured with facts, it would collapse. The first step was forensic analysis. I hired a document examiner, someone who looks at the pressure of a pen the way a detective looks at footprints. The examiner compared the signature on the amendment to my father's known handwriting. There were subtle differences. The pressure was lighter in places where my father's hand would press harder. The flourish at the end of the name was slightly off. The notary's stamp, when examined under magnification, showed a misalignment that suggested it had been applied after the page had been handled. These were small things, but in court, small things add up. Next, I hired a forensic accountant. Money leaves a trail if you know where to look. The accountant traced the $12.6 million through a maze of transfers and shell accounts. The money hadn't simply vanished. It had been moved with intent. There were transfers timed to coincide with the amendment, payments to a company that listed Vivian as a director, and a pattern of withdrawals that suggested premeditation. The accountant's report became a map of Vivian's financial maneuvers. I also collected witness statements. The housekeeper remembered overhearing a late-night call where Vivian said, "We'll make sure the future is secure." The estate attorney admitted he'd been rushed and that Vivian had insisted on certain phrasing. A neighbor produced a photo of Vivian at a bank the week before the amendment was filed. Each testimony was ordinary and human, and that ordinariness made it credible. Emotionally, the work was grueling. Gathering proof meant reliving humiliation. It meant reading the amendment over and over until the ink blurred. It meant sitting in a lawyer's office and answering questions that felt like reopening a wound. I practiced testimony in front of a mirror, learning to keep my voice steady when recounting painful moments. The body had to stop betraying the mind. The hands that once trembled at Vivian's heels needed to be steady in a courtroom. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, I would lie awake and wonder if this was worth it. Would the court understand the slow erosion of dignity? Would witnesses hold up under pressure? Would Vivian's charm win in the end? Those doubts were real, but they were also fuel. Each time I felt small, I thought of the photo she'd posted, the smile, the caption, the likes. That image had been a public celebration of a private theft. It would become evidence. The turning point came at a charity gala, one of Vivian's favorite stages. She arrived in a gown that glittered under the lights, a smile that had been rehearsed for cameras. She gave a speech about stewardship and family values, and the room applauded. I sat in the audience, feeling the old ache, but also a cold clarity. The gala was a performance, and performances leave traces, speeches, guest lists, photographs. I had the evidence. The decision was made. My lawyer filed a civil claim alleging undue influence and fraud. The complaint was precise. The amendment, the forensic analysis, the accountant's tracing, and the witness statements. The goal was not to ruin Vivian for the sake of cruelty. It was to hold her accountable in a way that would protect me and others from future harm. The plan was to turn the staged smiles and curated images into evidence. Vivian, for her part, didn't see it coming. She continued to perform, to post, to demand the public face. Arrogance is a dangerous thing. It makes people assume they're untouchable. Her confidence became the very thing that would expose her. She mocked my lawyer in a social post, called the claims sour grapes, and continued to present herself as the family's savior. Each public boast became another piece of the mosaic. Preparation required discipline. My lawyer taught me how to answer questions without getting pulled into emotional traps. Short answers, she said. Don't let her bait you. We rehearsed cross-examination, anticipated defenses, and prepared to counter them with facts. The courtroom would be a place where the private cruelty became public record, where witnesses would speak, and where Vivian's curated image would be tested against reality. As the trial date approached, the emotional stakes intensified. The community started to notice. People who had once liked Vivian's posts began to ask questions. The estate attorney who'd been reticent at first sent a private message. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The housekeeper offered to testify. The gala guest who'd applauded Vivian's speech admitted they'd felt uneasy afterward. The momentum shifted. There were tactical moves too. We subpoenaed bank records, preserved social media posts, and obtained metadata for the amendment file. The forensic examiner prepared a report that explained, in plain language, why the signature was suspect. The accountant's tracing showed a clear path from the estate account to entities linked to Vivian. The witnesses were ready. The plan was not about spectacle, it was about precision. On the eve of the trial, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear because courtrooms are unpredictable and because Vivian would fight back. Relief because the silence that had been forced upon me was finally being broken in a formal, undeniable way. The next day, I would stand in a room full of strangers and tell the truth. The slow work of gathering proof had turned humiliation into a weapon of clarity. What follows is the courtroom showdown, the moment when the evidence is laid out, when the recording is played, and when the room goes silent. Stay with me because the payoff is not just legal. It's emotional, cathartic, and deeply satisfying. The courthouse smelled like coffee and paper, a neutral scent that pretends to be impartial. Clara's voice softens as she sets the scene. If you've ever sat in a room waiting for a verdict, you know how time stretches. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands folded, the forensic reports stacked like small, heavy books. Across the room, Vivian sat with a practiced expression, the same smile she used for photos, the same posture she used to command a room. She had a lawyer who spoke in polished sentences and a presence that suggested she believed the world would side with her. Opening statements began. Vivian's attorney painted a picture of a loving household, of a woman who had stepped in to provide stability. It was the narrative Vivian had spent years curating. Then my lawyer stood and spoke in a different tone, quieter, precise, and devastating in its ordinary detail. This case isn't about a single transfer, she said. It's about a pattern of behavior designed to manipulate and erase. She laid out the evidence, the amendment, the forensic analysis, the accountant's tracing of the $12.6 million, the social media posts, and the witness statements. Each piece was small on its own, but together they formed a mosaic that contradicted Vivian's public image. Witnesses took the stand. The housekeeper described late-night calls and odd bank activity. The estate attorney admitted he'd been rushed and that Vivian had insisted on certain phrasing. The neighbor testified about seeing Vivian at the bank the week before the amendment was filed. Each testimony was simple, human, and credible. The jury listened. The room felt like a scale, each witness a weight that tipped the balance. When it was my turn, the courtroom seemed to narrow. The judge's bench loomed, the jury's faces blurred at the edges, and Vivian's eyes were a fixed point. I opened the forensic report and began to speak. Not in a dramatic, theatrical way, but in a voice that carried the weight of truth. I described the amendment not just as a legal document, but as a wound, the way it erased plans, the way it turned a legacy into a ledger. I described the physical sensations that had accompanied the humiliation, the tight throat, the nights of restless sleep, the way laughter had become a foreign sound. Those show, don't tell details landed. They made the jury see the human cost of Vivian's actions. The defense tried to poke holes. She's making a mountain out of a molehill, one attorney said. Families have disagreements, but the evidence was methodical. The forensic analysis showed inconsistencies in the signature. The accountant's tracing revealed transfers to shell entities linked to Vivian. The witnesses corroborated the pattern. The gala speech, once a triumph, now read like a confession when paired with a financial trail. Then came the moment that shifted everything. My lawyer presented a recording, a private message Vivian had sent to a confidant, boasting about how she'd secured the future and how appearances were everything. The message was casual, cruel, and revealing. Vivian's face, which had been composed, flickered. The recording was a mirror that reflected the person she'd been in private, and the mirror shattered the image she'd sold to the world. You could feel the room change. People leaned forward. The judge's pen paused. Vivian's smile, which had been a shield, cracked. She stood, voice sharp, and tried to reclaim the narrative. I was protecting the family, she said. I was acting in good faith. But the jury had heard the pattern. The witnesses had spoken. The recording had exposed the private cruelty. The judge's instructions were clear, deliberate on the facts. When the verdict came, the courtroom held its breath. There's a sound in a courtroom when a verdict lands, like a door closing. The jury found in my favor. The judge ordered the $12.6 million returned to the estate, awarded damages for emotional distress, and issued injunctions preventing Vivian from accessing certain accounts and public platforms. It was a legal victory, yes, but the emotional payoff was deeper. Vivian's public image unraveled. The social media posts that once earned likes now drew scrutiny. People who had once admired her began to question the curated life she'd presented. The gala photos were reinterpreted. Friends distanced themselves. The housekeeper's testimony led to other revelations about how Vivian had manipulated household staff. The community that had once applauded her now watched as the consequences of her behavior unfolded. For me, the relief was not immediate fireworks. It was quieter, a breath that didn't feel like it might be taken away, a sleep that wasn't punctured by the memory of a stolen future. In court, I had reclaimed a voice. Outside, the world began to treat me differently, not because of a dramatic transformation, but because the record now matched the person I had always been. People apologized. The estate attorney sent a note. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. The housekeeper hugged me in private. The gala guest admitted they'd felt uneasy and wanted to help. The emotional release was complicated. I felt vindicated, yes, but also sad for what had been lost. The father who had trusted the wrong person, the years of small humiliations, the trust that had been eroded. Revenge had not erased the past. It had, however, created a boundary. The court's orders were legal lines that protected me from future manipulation. The verdict was a public acknowledgement that what had been done was wrong. Clara's voice softens as she wraps the story. Revenge isn't always about spectacle. Sometimes it's about justice that restores dignity. My life moved forward in small, steady ways. There were still awkward family gatherings, but now I had a legal shield and a community that understood. The $12.6 million was back where it belonged, not as a trophy for a smiling thief, but as part of an estate that would be managed transparently. The stepmother's smile, once a weapon, had been exposed as a mask. In the end, the story is about more than money. It's about how a person who is made to feel powerless can use truth, patience, and the law to reclaim themselves. It's about how public humiliation can be turned into public accountability. And it's about the quiet satisfaction of seeing a carefully curated image fall apart under the weight of reality. Justice isn't always dramatic, I say. Sometimes it's patient, precise, and painfully ordinary. If you've ever been underestimated, remember, evidence matters, and truth has a way of finding a stage. If this story gave you chills, smash that like button and tell us in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever witnessed? And, of course, subscribe for more true-feeling stories of justice and closure. I'm Clara. Thanks for listening.